Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, has left an undeniable mark on the region, but it also has a darker side that is often overlooked. While it aimed to establish a Jewish state, it also led to the displacement and suffering of the indigenous Palestinian population. Today, we explore the history of Zionism through the eyes of the Palestinian people and examine the consequences of this movement on those who called Palestine home. For centuries, Jewish communities lived in Palestine alongside Muslims and Christians. Jews had never been completely absent from the land, and small Jewish populations remained in cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed. They coexisted with the Palestinian Arabs, who were the majority in the region. Palestine, under Ottoman rule, was a multicultural society. But this would change in the late 19th century when political Zionism sought to establish a Jewish homeland, not through peaceful coexistence, but by creating a state for Jews, which would disrupt the existing social fabric. By the late 19th century, anti-Semitism was on the rise across Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, where pogroms violently targeted Jewish communities. In response, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist, advocated for a Jewish state as the solution to the Jewish problem in Europe. In 1896, Herzl published The Jewish State, where he proposed the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. Herzl's vision was fueled by the need for Jewish self-determination, but it overlooked one key fact. The land of Palestine was already home to an indigenous population, Palestinians, who had lived there for centuries. Herzl and the early Zionist leaders saw Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land, ignoring the fact that by the 19th century there were about 500,000 Arabs living in Palestine, making up over 90% of the population. While Jews had been living in Palestine for centuries, the late 19th century saw the arrival of new waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe, driven by Zionism and often backed by wealthy European benefactors. These new arrivals purchased land from absentee Ottoman landlords, displacing Palestinian farmers who had worked the land for generations. Palestinian resistance began as early as the first Aliyah, or wave of Jewish immigration, in the 1880s. Palestinian farmers who found themselves dispossessed protested and clashed with the new settlers. The Palestinian people quickly realized that the Zionist project was not just a religious revival, but a political movement aimed at creating a Jewish state at the expense of their land and livelihoods. Chapter 4. The Balfour Declaration and its Consequences, 1917 to the 1940s. World War I dramatically altered the political landscape of the Middle East. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Britain took control of Palestine. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the infamous Balfour Declaration, promising the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was a turning point for the Zionist movement, but it was issued without the consent of the Palestinian Arabs, who made up the majority of the population. The declaration, made by a colonial power, planted the seeds of future conflict. As Jewish immigration continued under British rule, tensions between Jews and Palestinians grew. Palestinians felt betrayed, their aspirations for self-determination ignored. Protests erupted across the country in the 1920s and 1930s, with Palestinians demanding independence and an end to mass Jewish immigration. Chapter 5. The Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international city. Despite the Palestinians making up 2/3 of the population, they were allocated less than half of the land. Palestinian leaders rejected the plan, seeing it as unjust. Jewish leaders, however, accepted the partition, eager to finally realize the Zionist dream of a Jewish state. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Following the declaration, 5 Arab nations invaded and the 1948 Arab-Israeli War began. What followed for the Palestinian people is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes, many of whom fled or were expelled during the fighting. Entire villages were destroyed, and families that had lived in Palestine for generations found themselves as refugees in neighboring Arab countries. By the end of the war, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine, far more than was originally allocated in the UN partition plan. The Palestinians who had been driven from their homes were not allowed to return, marking the beginning of the ongoing Palestinian refugee crisis. Chapter 6. Occupation and Resistance, 1967 to present. The 1967 Six-Day War saw Israel capture the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem and other territories, bringing even more Palestinians under Israeli control. This marked the beginning of the ongoing Israeli occupation, with military rule imposed on millions of Palestinians. Since then, Palestinians have lived under occupation, enduring land confiscations, settlement expansion, home demolitions and restricted movement. Despite international condemnation, Israeli settlements continue to grow, making the prospects for a two-state solution seem increasingly distant. Chapter 7. Zionism today and the Palestinian struggle. Today, Zionism remains a powerful force in Israeli politics, but for Palestinians it represents the continued displacement and occupation of their land. For many Palestinians, Zionism is synonymous with colonization and erasure of their identity and history. Though peace talks have been attempted, the situation remains unresolved. Palestinians continue to fight for their right to return to their homes and for an end to the occupation. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not just a fight over land. It is a fight for justice, recognition, and the right to exist in peace.